Hello everyone, it's Rob here. Listen, it's YouTube. You know what to do. Hit the bell and the thumbs up, right? Okay, I'll talk to you later. Bye. Oh, you know what? Before Aaron joins us, let's watch this clip. So he mentions this clip from the Norman Bethune movie in this piece he just did, but let's watch it before he joins the show. So this is Donald Sutherland as Norman Bethune. I think this came out in 1990. But this is a very powerful clip. Check this out. This is really cool. It's actually very cool that we took that for a while. This man became a celebrated figure in Canadian history. And it's like, I'm not sure if we're going to be going through a time when we celebrate people like this anytime soon.
I went to Ottawa to request permission from the Prime Minister to recommend a Canadian ambulance in Spain. Permission to recommend an ambulance that would represent Canada in this democratic struggle against that fascist scourge, and Mr. William Lyon Mackenzie King turned me down flat. This is the same William Lyon Mackenzie King who has since been photographed shaking hands with the biggest murderer in the world today, Adolf Hitler.
Sir.
Sir.
Are you a red?
Yes.
Was that singing I hear? Is that singing I hear, folks? That's cool. I've never actually seen the movie. I would kind of like to see it. Okay, good timing. Here's Aaron Giovannone. Let's talk to Aaron. Hello, Aaron. Are you there? Do you hear me?
Yeah, I'm here.
How's it going, sir?
Good, good. How are you doing?
Good. Let me just hold on. Let me just figure out the screen here.
I'll rely on you for that.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, folks, it's Aaron Giovannone. Welcome. Thanks for joining the stream, Aaron. This is cool to talk to you about this.
Oh, pleasure to be here. Hey, everybody.
Yeah, look at all these books. This man's got a lot of books.
Oh, I made sure that they're visible. Like that's all the books I have.
we got some high level talk coming.
Oh gosh, please. Please don't oversell me. I'm really happy to be here, though, talking Bethune.
Yeah, me too. We talked. We broached this a little bit. We talked a little bit about. I mean, I just mentioned you were coming on earlier. I talked a little bit about who Bethune was. Like, we have a lot of like American and other people from all over the world that watch this channel, so not everyone's familiar with this story. So we went over that a little bit earlier, but I would like to have you get into that as well. Before that, I have people asking about the plants. Do you have anything interesting about the plants to mention? It's a good plant setup you have.
Oh yeah, on. Thanks. It is pretty intentional. I have I do a little bit of YouTube in myself, and so I try to have like a nice backdrop there. I also like teach online somewhat, so
okay, yeah.
I try to like have like an aesthetically pleasing and like maybe like calming green and living background. I do have a green thumb. It's one thing I kind of like. I really like that summer's coming around now too.
Yeah, that's going to be nice.
Out on the balcony growing some tomatoes, stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
So that's very, very much my shit. I really enjoy that stuff.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. Okay. Now that that's out of the way, Aaron, let's talk about Norman Bethune. Again, not everyone watching this knows who Bethune is and what his deal was. We went over it earlier, but not everyone was around for that. So why don't you just begin by explaining who this guy is and why did Norman Bethune become kind of a celebrated cultural figure, non-controversial, celebrated Canadian figure after the fall of the Cold War, and how is that changing in the current climate with our positioning with China? That's a big question, but just start with telling us who Bethune, who this guy is.
Yeah, absolutely. Bethune is a guy that I think Canadians know, because he did at a certain point in the 1970s, and then especially like in the 90s, enter a canon of official Canadian heroes. But Bethune's story is goes back much further. He's born in I believe 1890 in Gravenhurst, Ontario, which is a small town north of Toronto in the Muskoka region, and he's like from rather like upper middle class stock. He's I think Scottish background. His parents were they were like missionaries at some point, and then also kind of a Presbyterian preachers. But his grandfather had been like a rather high level doctor, so there were a lot of doctors in his family, which is what he became. So he went to the University of Toronto Medical School. I think that's where he went. Although he interned later in London. He served in World War I as medical personnel where he was wounded, and then by the time he's a mature man in the 1930s, he's in Montreal, and he's like a well-known doctor and man about town in Montreal, well-known thoracic surgeon. So he was his specialization was the lungs, and tuberculosis was like a really big problem in that era. And so he studied tuberculosis and how to treat it, and he had lots of experimental techniques, that many of them which worked. And he was known for being very class conscious too. So the 1930s and the Depression really radicalized Bethune. He starts to see tuberculosis as a class disease. That is, if you're wealthy and you can afford time in a sanatorium, not working, and you can afford care, then you generally were cured of tuberculosis. And in fact, Norman Bethune at some point, he contracted tuberculosis too while he was treating it. And he survived it. And he realized that poor people didn't have the same positive outcomes. So he started to see it as a class problem. And of course, the 1930s is like tremendous ferment on the left in Montreal, especially. And he becomes, I'm not sure at what point exactly, but he becomes a communist. He joins the Canadian Communist Party. I know he visits Russia, and he sees a public healthcare system that works. And this sort of turns him into an advocate of public healthcare, a very early advocate of public healthcare. We're still, we're in the late 30s here, mid 30s. And
yeah, he's kind of a grandfather of universal healthcare, even though he died before that. He died before that became instituted here. He was one of the earliest advocates for switching to this system for this exact reason, right?
Exactly, and that was like crazy. It sounded like crazy at the time, right? This guy really was, he was a red. He was like a dirty commie, and he was really, he was really marginalized by Canadian officialdom. So we had a liberal government in the late 30s run by Mackenzie King. And, he had, no truck at all with Bethune, although Bethune started to become more of a public figure as he gave public talks, and he kind of went on a lecture circuit. And he was trying to drum up support for the Spanish Civil War. So this is kind of like getting into the really radical years of Bethune. But by the time the Spanish Civil War comes around, like Bethune decides he's going to go help, and he does. And so, as
a number of Canadians did during that time, right? Like unofficially,
I think about 1,000, maybe a little more. Canadians joined the like Republican communist cause in Spain. And again, the Canadian government was like 100% against this. Like they were trying to stop them from going. They were discouraging them. They were trying to put barriers on them going, barriers on them returning. They did not support, their official position was neutrality, but what they were really administratively and bureaucratically, what they were doing was essentially favoring the fascists.
Yeah, sure.
In Spain. Yeah.
It's a way of favoring Franco without saying that you're doing that, when you're preventing people from going to oppose that,
Exactly. So they were they were, there's actually a scene in the movie about Bethune that I guess we'll get into in a little bit later, but there is like a really vivid scene where he's on his lecture tour in Canada, trying to drum up support for the Spanish Civil War. And he mentions how Mackenzie King like won't help. He won't fund a Canadian ambulance unit to help the soldiers in Spain. So I guess Bethune's kind of claim to fame medically, it comes about during the Spanish Civil War. He develops a mobile blood transfusion system. He discovers that you can store blood and refrigerate it and then transport it to the front lines where it'd be readily available for transfusion. And, that really saved a lot of soldiers' lives. So he became sort of well known for that. And I think there's some like confusion, some like I would say controversy about why Bethune returns to Canada when he does, but he does return to Canada from Spain, and he goes on his lecture circuit. He's really talking about public health care at this point, and I think we're in like 1938, I think, and then he decides to go to China to help essentially the communist cause there. And so this is 1939, Mao's Eighth Army. They'd been fighting a civil war in China for a while, but at this point, they're fighting the invading Japanese, the fascist forces, who, I think, in those years ended up killing like 30 million Chinese. And so it's kind of an unambiguously good cause at the time. And he goes and he offers his medical services there, and he meets Mao, and he becomes a hero, partly because he dies while he's serving there. He cuts himself while in surgery. He gets blood poisoning and he dies soon after. And he's known, at that point, I think Mao wrote a famous essay in praise of Norman Bethune. And
that became part of the teaching, and during the Cultural Revolution, that became a required reading for Chinese students in that period, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, fast forward to the 60s and the Cultural Revolution, and Bethune is a part of Mao's legacy, I would say. And so this essay I think it's called on self-sacrifice or in praise of self-sacrifice. I'm not sure, but the theme is the sacrifice that Norman Bethune made to basically the international workers' cause. And so in China, he really is, a hero of the revolution, one of the pantheon of important figures. And this is after 1939, these are years where Canada has basically no official diplomatic relations with China. And this really changes. Should I keep going into the modern, the more modern era, the 60s and 70s? Are there actually? I'm curious. Are there any Bethune heads out there? Because I think if you're a Canadian communist, you kind of dig Bethune and you know a lot about him, and probably maybe some people out there know more about him.
I think the Canadian commies in the chat definitely are familiar. But what I find interesting, the part of this story is, so it's the 90s, the Soviet Union has collapsed, the Berlin Wall comes down, the Cold War's over. And because of the Dengist economic reforms of, I believe, the 1980s, you have these Western powers like Canada and the US that are kind of enthusiastically welcoming China into this new global economic order of supposed free market capitalism, right? So at this point, it's an interesting period because you have, in Canada, we're trying to normalize relations with China, and this film that you're talking about, the film about Norman Bethune, starring Sutherland, which China helped finance, was part of this effort to build bridges and build this kind of cultural connection between Canada and China. And this is why during this period, even though we haven't have a long legacy of lionizing and canonizing communists in this country, and in fact we do the opposite and demonize them and shun them, at this point
Bethune's the only one.
At this point it became kind of acceptable to praise Norman Bethune and to kind of elevate him into this uncontroversial, beloved Canadian figure, right? And that's when this movie was created. right?
Yeah, exactly. And but Bethune is such a fascinating figure, just like historically who he was, like pretty awesome guy, quite frankly, like this swashbuckling humanitarian, and really did sacrifice himself for like an important cause. But like he is totally basically I would say like leading up to the 90s, it's a really important part. I would just say that there is like an opening to China that begins really in the 70s, right? So famously, Nixon visits China in 1972. And in 1973, the Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, father of our current Prime Minister, he visits China too. And he's like the first in-office Prime Minister to shake Mao's hand. And so the beginning of the normalization of relations and an opening up to Western capitalism is beginning a little bit then. And it is exactly at that moment that Bethune comes into play as this important cultural figure who can bridge the two cultures. And so, Pierre Trudeau, like for all of his like cynical uses of socialism and the left, like he did know like about Bethune, and he was like aware of, like he knew about Mao, like he understood the theory and history, and so he did understand the importance of Bethune to the Chinese. And so
and even Trudeau, I mean, of course Trudeau was not a socialist by any stretch, but he did show a willingness to meet with people like Fidel and Mao and to like normalize these kind of relationships, which you have to kind of give him credit for, because that wasn't always the easiest stance to take at that time, right?
Yeah, in those years, the late 60s and the early 70s, you'd say that he was like kind of a left liberal, or in the tradition of left liberalism in Canada, following Pearson, who was the Liberal Prime Minister he kind of took over from. I would say you have to give him some credit for that, but what he really is smart. Like he's like he understands the cultural value of Bethune. So the very year that Pierre Trudeau visits China and meets Mao for the first time, Norman Bethune's birth home in Gravenhurst, Ontario, is purchased by the Department of External Affairs, which I think tells you everything, to turn it into like a historic site, and it's currently a museum. So this kind of recuperation of Bethune as a Canadian hero, it happens exactly the moment when we're trying to open relations with China. And in the 1970s, although there had been interest in Bethune was kind of like an edgy kind of countercultural figure. Before that, like there were like the literati of Canada knew Bethune, they knew of him. I think I provide the example of like a famous Canadian novelist named Hugh MacLennan, who in mid-century, he was like the Canadian writer. He won the Governor General's Award a couple of times, which is like big award. It was like the only literary award back then in Canada, basically. And he writes this novel where there's basically a Bethune character, a character based on Bethune. So there's like, and then earlier in the 60s, there's actually a really good documentary about Norman Bethune that I would recommend anyone to see if they haven't already. It's by the National Film Board of Canada. It's free online. I think it's from 1964. And it's like a very, you learn a lot about Bethune, and it's generally positive. So Bethune has like some support amongst left liberals or the literati, the intelligentsia, let's say in Canada. They know of him, and he's interesting, but he's edgy, certainly not for popular consumption. Sure. And this really does kind of change in the 70s, where all of a sudden there's a bunch of new books written about Bethune. So suddenly there's money available from funding agencies. These all kind of lead back eventually to the government in Canada, because Canadian arts and culture sector is heavily subsidized by provincial and federal agencies. And so there's lots of money now and lots of interest in Bethune in the 70s. And Donald Sutherland, famous Canadian actor, already really famous in the 70s. He is recruited to play Norman Bethune in a CBC television production in 1977. And that's when he kind of falls in love with the role of Bethune. And so this is all happening in the 70s already. By the time we get to the 1990s, the early 90s, Cold War is over now. And there's an even more aggressive recruitment of Chinese business. They're seeking it really, really aggressively. And this whole movie about Bethune was like part of, again, like this kind of a continuation and an escalation of building these new cultural relations with China. And Canada's not the only country doing this at the time. I research like, literature and film and stuff. And so if you look at the late 80s, there's actually quite a few films about China. Like China was having a moment in popular culture. So there's I'm forgetting the name of it now, but there was a Steven Spielberg movie filmed in China.
Is that The Last Emperor?
No. So The Last Emperor was the other great example of that time, which is Bernardo Bertolucci.
Okay.
Beautiful movie. And it's that was like, I think it basically won every Academy Award in 1987. So there was also a Steven Spielberg movie, I think maybe a year before that, or maybe it was even the same year. I forget the name of it now. Empire of the Sun.
Yeah, that's it. I thought it was something like that. Yeah. That's it.
So in the late 80s,
that was with Christian Bale, I think.
Christian Bale as a kid.
Young Christian Bale.
He's like a child actor in that one.
Yeah.
So the late 80s, China's opening up, and there's like kind of a cultural rapprochement with the West. And this movie that becomes the most expensive Canadian film production ever is part of that process.
Cool. So, what made you want to revisit this story now and revisit the story of Bethune and talk about this movie? Because it's become, unfortunately, it's become relevant again. I think that all this stuff, as we've shifted into this new territory, where, as I was pointing out, it's like we invited China to participate in this global market system, and we thought that was a way to sort of keep them in check and allow to perpetuate indefinitely the like U.S.-led but also Canadian-led global capitalist system. And now something kind of strange has happened, where now it seems like we're on the verge of being passed by China or America in particular, is being on the verge of being passed by China as a global economic superpower. And I think that's the primary reason why we've seen such a ramp up in the rhetoric and saber rattling against China, which we're seeing a number of people getting pulled into. And now Norman Bethune has come up in Canada as being like, as questioning that kind of, should we be celebrating this guy? Like, is that why you wanted to start writing with this piece?
Like one of the reasons I wanted to write about this movie is because it's kind of what I'm doing now. It's kind of my new project, is to like go back into Canada's cultural history. So look at film and literature, and kind of read it through a socialist lens. And so this is kind of part of my project. So, returning to the 90s, it's really funny because like the contrast with the current moment is like so obvious, right? Because the 90s, essentially, they were trying to make, in a way, like kind of pro-China propaganda. Like the Canadian government basically wanted to change our minds about China at that moment. And so they start making they fund movies that have that purposefully have like a positive message about China. Now, I'm not using propaganda in the necessarily derisive way. It's just that it's like a communication that has a particular purpose in mind, at least by the people who are funding it. Right?
Yeah, well, it's like signaling to people, no, China, they're good now. They're participating in the global economy. We like them now. So we're going to try and put funding and resources into ensuring that people kind of get that message through culture, absorb it through culture.
Yeah, and I was just looking at this movie and thinking, wow, I can't believe this movie got made.
It's pretty incredible right now to look at this and see some of this stuff.
Exactly. I'm looking from 2021, looking back and going, oh, wow. Okay. So what has changed? What historically in that moment made that movie possible? What made the conservative government, the conservative federal government at the time, what made them fund this? Because it was their choice to make this movie. And so that was to me fascinating. And I really liked to just kind of dig into the kind of the making of the movie, which was, there was kind of a lot of drama around it that has really not anything to do with the politics of the film at all.
It's still fun to get into, though. Yeah.
Yeah. Should I get into it a little bit?
Let's hear about some of this stuff.
Donald Sutherland. I mean, that's kind of the big hook for talking about this movie too, because Donald Sutherland, really famous, well-known actor, and he's pretty good, I have to say. Hadn't thought that much about Donald Sutherland, but I have seen a few movies lately with him in them, and he's very fiery, passionate, kind of often has a kind of psychotic energy. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, he was the man in the 70s and 80s. I mean, he was all over the place. He was extremely successful at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at the time of this movie, he's commanding about $1 million for a role. And, apparently he wanted to play Bethune so much that he took a pay cut. So he only received $500,000 for his role in this movie. When you think about it, like if this movie cost $18 million, as I said, the most expensive film at the time, Canadian film at the time, that's like a big chunk of the budget is just to pay Donald Sutherland to be there.
They got to get the big bucks if you want Sutherland in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, one other, so Donald Sutherland, you kind of don't need to say that much about him. He's such a star. But the other character involved in this film that I really had fun learning about was the screenwriter for the movie. His name is Ted Allen. And he's this really fascinating, he was a Canadian communist from Montreal. He knew Bethune in Montreal. Like Ted Allen was a good 20 years younger than Bethune, sort of looked up to Bethune as a well-known, but also politically and artistically kind of interesting. I guess, Ted Allen refers to him, looks to him kind of like a father figure. And actually Ted Allen, he goes to Spain and he reports about the Spanish Civil War. Well, he's there while Bethune is there. And he's writing for the Daily Clarion, which is like a Canadian communist newspaper of the time. Ted Allen also wrote a really wonderful novel based on the Spanish Civil War. It was published in 1939. It's called This Time a Better Earth. And it's just kind of like a fun read. It's kind of like an adventure war novel, but it has all this really cool politics in it because he's a communist, kind of on the right side of the conflict. So I think probably influenced a little bit by Ernest Hemingway, who wrote, his Spanish Civil War novel too.
Well, I was going to ask, did Bethune and Hemingway know each other? Did you come across this? Because I know they were in there at around the same time. I mean, For Whom the Bell Tolls, that's probably my favorite novel of all time.
Oh, wow.
So it's cool that they were probably there together around the same time and participating in the same struggle, right?
Yeah, I'm assuming they did. I don't know about Bethune specifically, but Ted Allen, the writer, absolutely was. He knew Ernest Hemingway. And so, Rob, I'd recommend that novel that from 1939 by Ted Allen. Actually, I think you might like it.
I would love that.
Yeah, it's really a good read. Ted Allen, after he what happens after Civil War for him? He comes back he actually works in the United States for a while. He works at the War Office. He's he joins the war effort in an information office in New York, and then he goes to Hollywood and he's writing for the movies. And in 1942, way back in 1942, this is a couple of years after Bethune has died, Ted Allen sells a screenplay to, I think, 20th Century Fox, the story of Norman Bethune's life. And it just never gets produced because within a couple of years, there's the whole purges of the Hollywood.
McCarthy
so Ted Allen, for a while, Ted Allen had quite a Hollywood career going before basically the purge of the left and of the communists, the Hollywood 10. Ted Allen comes back to Canada. He settles in Toronto. He works for the CBC, and he writes for radio. He writes for television. And the Cold War chill, the McCarthyism kind of creeps up, and it kind of arrives in Canada a little bit later. But as he sees that maybe some of his career opportunities are going to be limited, he then takes off again and he goes to London and he starts to write for the stage. And he has a very successful career writing for the London stage, writing for actually in Paris as well. His work was translated. And, he has this whole, and he's always a communist, essentially. I mean, he's very critical of Stalin. But he never kind of gives up those politics, and he often writes about them. And so, in the 1970s, when the Cold War chills really diminished and it's cool to be left again, he comes back to Canada and he makes more movies here. And I would say that the best movie of his, better than the Bethune movie, is a movie called Lies My Father Told Me. It's from 1975. It was filmed in Montreal, and it was nominated for some Oscars. I think it won some Golden Globes. And it's just a really interesting story of his youth in Montreal. And actually Ted Allen appears in the movie. He's an old man at this point, and he's the neighbor who's a learned communist, and he's trying to he's a cool guy who's trying to teach the main characters about how the economy works and stuff. It's it's a really cool movie. I really recommend that one too. So that's Ted Allen. So Ted Allen, all these years though, he never was able to make the movie about Norman Bethune as he wanted to. I didn't mention that he had written a book too that was quite successful in the 50s about Norman Bethune. And it was like the story of Bethune's life. So Ted Allen always had this connection to Bethune. He always had this movie in mind. And it isn't until the kind of late 80s that he can secure the funding to make this film. There's a small production company in Montreal who actually involves Ted Allen's daughter, Julie, who's part of the production team. And they, basically there's a lot of diplomacy, a lot of, bureaucratic wrangling, but they secure the money from Telefilm Canada. They secure a deal with Chinese funders, with French funders to finally make the movie. And of course, if you're going to make a big movie, you need a big star. And Donald Sutherland is the guy they need to get. The problem is that Donald Sutherland doesn't really like Ted Allen. He doesn't like Ted Allen's book about Bethune. He has, there's controversies about.
There's creative differences.
There are differences, personality differences. I think ultimately there was like a struggle for control about like whose Bethune was going to be represented in this film. There's like some historiographic controversies about how good Ted Allen's like research on Norman Bethune really was. Proper historians since then have disproven some of the things that Ted Allen claimed. But whatever, Ted Allen is a showman. He's a Hollywood writer, so he has his version of Bethune in mind, and Donald Sutherland has his. And so what ends up happening is when they're filming, and it's a very difficult shoot in China, what happens is Donald Sutherland, with the support of the director, Phillip Borsos, he's another Canadian filmmaker who's directing this film, they start like subtly rewriting the script without the approval of the producers or Ted Allen. So they're on location kind of far away from the prying eyes of the producers. And they're like, basically Donald Sutherland is trying to like coup this movie and like make it into what he wanted it to be. And so I guess they rewrote a lot of the dialogue and filmed different scenes that hadn't been planned. And this, when the producers and Ted Allen find out about this, they're very angry. They see the first cut of the film that Phillip Borsos, the director, gives them. They're like, they hate it. And they take it from him. And they just say, no, get out of here. You're done. And they re-edit it themselves. And I'm not sure if they had to film some new scenes and stuff as well. But so there was basically this huge conflict in the making of the movie that I think really does the movie a grave disservice in the end. Because in my article, I point out there's a lot of lovely, this is a lot of lovely stuff in this film. I think it's very much worth watching. We
watched the scene right before you came on when they sing the International
cool
song
right?
With that's really cool. Yeah, I love it. It was really neat.
It's really cool. I mean, it's funny to see Donald Sutherland just like giving the comrade salute.
Yeah.
International. It's fun. And there's a lot of beautiful scenery as well. Phillip Borsos, I think he was known for his ability to capture landscape. He had a movie from 1982 called The Gray Fox, which again, I've watched recently, and it's really beautiful. It's set in Western Canada. It's like the BC coast and interior. And it's like a historical drama from like the 19th century, set in the 19th century. So it's beautiful landscape. And he does the same in China. There's like beautiful scenes of the mountains and the rivers and like, like meetings by torchlight. It's just like the cinematography is quite nice. But like narratively, this movie is kind of a disaster. Okay. And I kind of lay the blame on the producers and maybe ultimately Ted Allen, although I'm not sure what decisions he was making ultimately in the we would
need to see the script versus the shooting script. We would need to make comparisons.
Exactly. But if the big problem watching this film beginning to end is like it's so confusing in time wise, because there's like flashbacks within flashbacks, and it's just constructed in such a convoluted narrative way that it does lose its kind of forward momentum. But if you're just like want to see some cool scenery and some neat costumes and like I think like scene by scene, this is like a really interesting movie. Just like together, it doesn't quite narratively work.
It doesn't hold together.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why some people in this country are now reevaluating Bethune, and it's particularly people of a more reactionary tendency that are saying, well, I'm referring to this article that came out in the National Post last week, March 10th.
They scooped me.
They scooped
me.
you,
I had
yeah.
written the article was done. My article
Okay,
was done
wow.
when that
So
came
it's
out.
pretty serendipitous
Yeah.
that you're putting this out. There's an article in the National Post by Kelly McParland, Cancel Culture and the Case of Maoist Martyr, Dr. Norman Bethune. So do you want to talk about a little bit? We can get more into this.
Yeah, well, yeah. So there's
About
one
how
little piece.
why are we reevaluating this figure now? And what do you
Okay, well,
make
there's
about that?
one little piece of the history like after the film that
Okay.
I should fill in, and then we'll get to exactly to this.
Okay.
Like basically what happens like after beginning in the 70s and it really accelerates in the 90s is like a perfect like basically Bethune is like totally recuperated as a cool Canadian guy. And this happens through the propaganda efforts of films like this, Bethune, The Making of a Hero. But it also happens like institutionally in many ways. Like it's beginning in the 90s that you see suddenly like, I don't know, the Department of Medicine. I think the Department of Medicine at U of T is like the Bethune School. Or like that's like a very common thing that starts happening is that things get named after Bethune.
There was a Bethune Street in my hometown where I grew up in Brockville, Ontario.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, there's in Montreal, I think the first place I really encountered Bethune as a young man is there's a statue of Bethune by the Guy Concordia station, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the first time when I was like younger that I encountered Bethune. So this like canonization of Bethune as acceptable Canadiana begins, it really kind of accelerates in the 90s, and you see it like all basically up until I would say probably around 2008. I think around that time, there's basically like the status quo is it's okay to do. We're doing business with China now, and China is a cool capitalist country, basically, and we have no problem with them anymore. And so you see kind of as a reflection of that, you have Bethune canonized very thoroughly. It's important to know, like at that time, like Bethune can be, what he can be is a hero of national Medicare. And hey, in Canada, already in the 70s, like that's a thing we have, and that's a thing that we really identify Canadian nationhood with. And Bethune can be a figure of that, right? Also, Bethune can be kind of recuperated just as like a humanitarian, a kind of doctor without borders. You know?
And by the way, it's hilarious the way that we've incorporated that into our national identity, considering the ways like our elites of that time fought vigorously against that and demonized people like Bethune for making these kinds of statements. That now that it's become this incredibly popular thing, now we have people being how it's inseparable somehow from Canadian culture, which is hilarious because they really struggled against instituting that in the first place.
Absolutely. Bethune, like decades and decades and decades ahead of time, is advocating for these things. So much later, the state will appropriate those parts of his legacy, kind of conveniently kind of forgetting his politics, forgetting that he was like he believed in the communist cause, the communist revolution. All that stuff is basically wiped from his memory. And we just have this kind of this, this is like a figure of internationalism, humanitarian internationalism, a figure who supports public health care, etc.
Lenin writes a lot about this stuff, by the way. Lenin, like he wrote about all this shit in 1919. It's still happening. The way that figures like Bethune, when they end up becoming these popular canonized figures, are kind of robbed of their revolutionary potential and robbed of any of these kinds of rough edges. Lenin spoke about this very forcefully in the way that he had seen it happen to Marx in his day. Sorry, I digress, though.
No, that's a great point. And, Bethune, he's like, divested of his politics, recuperated as a Canadian national hero. And that continues apace until about 2008, 2010. And I think probably, one of the reasons why it starts to slow down then is partly because relations with China kind of begin to cool in some ways after the great financial crisis. I think some of the basic tenets of neoliberalism that had been guiding the relationship between the two countries, between China and the rest of the world, kind of start to break down. China weathers that crisis much better economically and kind of starts to really pull ahead afterwards, in comparison with many of the Western countries. So I think the canonization of Bethune really follows the ebbs and flows of our diplomatic and political economic relationships with China, which starts to change definitely. I think like around around 2008, 2010. Now it's like even after Trump, who basically normalized anti-China rhetoric. And of course, it's being embraced fully by the liberal establishment as well.
Well, and you could argue that it started under Obama as well. Like Obama kind of, I think, started that kind of rhetoric that Trump then took to that kind of next level. And now we're seeing continuity with Biden, where there's no real daylight in between, like Biden's approach to China and the very reactionary far right Donald Trump version.
Yeah, I mean, I think Obama's Trans-Pacific trade deal he was trying to set up, that was very much about competing with China, marginalizing China in the region. And I think, so this was like, there was a growing recognition that China was now a threat, was not content to be like a lower value producer in the international system, was threatening to surpass the United States in many ways, in many sectors. And so it suddenly becomes like kind of less cool to talk about Bethune in Canada. And so I think if you looked at a timeline of when did this statue of Bethune go up, or when did this street get named after Bethune, and when did this department get named after Bethune, that all kind of dries up around 2008, 2010. And here we are now in a moment that a lot of people are calling kind of a new Cold War, or at least they're trying to drum up a new Cold War.
I've been calling it a new Cold War. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we have the really fascinating that National Post article. Who was it? It was Kelly what's her name?
Kelly McParland. Cancel culture and the case of Maoist martyr.
Yeah.
Dr. Norman Bethune.
It's it's kind of a funny thing to encounter, right? So,
let me just read the first paragraph. The first paragraph is hilarious. In a world of cancel culture, where a statue can be pulled down for the failure to achieve 2021 standards in 1867. That's the only reason, by the way, we're against Johnny McDonald and stuff, because he's not quite hitting those woke standards that we've expected, and that's the only reason. And we shouldn't investigate it any farther.
He doesn't wear there's no pictures of him in kente cloth.
Exactly.
Big problem.
So because where a statue could be pulled down for the failure to achieve, what absolute dog shit, 2021 standards in 1867, it seems a bit odd to be honoring a man who learned to love communism in Stalin's Soviet Union and died serving a country now accused of genocide. So what to make of a Parks Canada plan to increase visitor traffic at the birthplace of Dr. Norman Bethune, who died in 1939 while aiding communist forces' efforts to seize power in China. And it's interesting, I'm getting mixed signals from Kelly McParland. I mean, you would think from reading this first paragraph that she was against cancel culture, but it turns out she actually does support it, depending on the ideology of the specific actions of the figure that we're discussing. So it doesn't seem to be a lot of crossover in between the ideological firmness that she's standing on there.
The takeaway is, I think, ultimately that yes, we'll cancel who we decide, who we like.
Maybe possibly slightly hypocritical there.
Yeah. I think ultimately what her argument would be a bit contorted. Well, according to their standards,
sure,
love cancel culture, they should be canceling him now. And they should be canceling Bethune now or whatever. So I don't know how you stay on this, Rob. I'm no, I don't think we should cancel Bethune.
No, I don't think we should cancel Bethune either. And I think now more than ever, we should celebrate Norman Bethune and what he did. Because if people have been watching the stream for a while, I've been very, very alarmed about the ways that this rhetoric has. You talked about 2012, 2013, or 2008, the financial crisis, as the beginning of this new kind of frostier diplomatic relationship with China, but the way that it has kind of accelerated, we almost passed through this anti-China singularity just in the last year, where now all of a sudden it seems like it's accelerated a lot. It's encompassing not only just liberals and reactionaries, but even people that are on the left that are kind of claim to come from a social democratic or an anarchist tradition. It's very, very fashionable to as well to join in this kind of climate of demonizing China. It's something that I've been very alarmed by, and I've been trying to push back against because I think it's kind of dangerous. And that's exactly why not only should we not cancel Bethune, I think more than ever, we should be talking about the important contribution that he's played to the cultural fabric of this country.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do kudos to you for for challenging anti-China rhetoric. Like it's like, you don't have to like everything about China to like understand that we have like, the West has like the United States has like, very like obvious political economic reasons for doing what it's doing. And you just have to look at how, discourse about China has changed over time to see, oh, okay, like why was it okay in 1990, like after the Tiananmen Square crisis? Like that was like a brutal crackdown. Like that wasn't great. That was a really bad thing about human rights, but like we still did business with them. We still normalized relations. It's just like pointing out the hypocrisy. Looking at history, you see how
you can count on me. You're gonna have good old Rob to talk you through all this.
Cancel culture should only be used on my and others' debt.
Exigencies of that moment, and here we are in a new one. And it's just like it's sad to see people who are on the left or have left sympathies, like kind of buy into the rhetoric and not read it more critically. So good work. Yeah, I mean, great work on the stream doing that. It's a difficult like argument to make, because in some ways, because you are afraid of like people like suddenly coming at you about this, like from the left.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult to make this argument sometimes. That's why I wanted to revisit this film, partly because it's a cultural thing. And it's like just a movie and it has like a kind of a fun story behind it, that you're able to address the politics kind of through the movie in a way that kind of insulates me anyway as the writer from some of that blowback.
Yeah. Well, it's a really interesting piece. I'm glad you did it. I'm glad you were able to come on and talk about this. It is a really interesting way to absorb this history and to talk about the ways that our relationship has shifted. I'm linking the piece there in Passage. It's called After the Cold War, China and Canada United to Honor Norman Bethune. So it's all, everything we talked about, it's all in this piece. Very, very good stuff.
Thanks, Rob. And I'll just say, if people want to watch the movie too, it's like available free, high definition streaming on YouTube too. So
yeah, we did mention that.
Cool.
Do you have anything else? By the way, thank you. I got to thank Fidel Clanco for the 3-month subscription. He said you didn't hear this because you were making a point. He said cancel culture should only be used on my and others' debt. That's something I happen to agree with as well. I would like to cancel some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Seen a number of good comments about your plant game. Many people have been supportive about the plants.
Thank you. I do it for you. I do it for the audience.
Yeah.
Thanks.
They've also
thumbs out there.
Yeah. They've also welcomed you to the no ironing crew, which is, we support that.
No. There's no iron in this house.
Yeah, absolutely. That's revisionist. Ironing is revisionist. We don't support that. Aaron Giavannone, again, thanks for coming on the show. Okay, so the other thing you host is Sweater. The work you do on YouTube is called Sweater Weather. I'll link to the channel as well. There, do you want to just plug that stuff and plug all the stuff you're doing before we sign off?
Sure. Yeah, look for my writing out there. As I said, like I'm into the kind of the political economy of culture, Canadian culture. So I'm going to have a lot more, I think, essays coming out this summer about topics. I'm going to write about Leonard Cohen pretty soon. Write about Leonard Cohen in the politics of the Cold War. I think it's a lens that we haven't really read him through. And I love Leonard Cohen and I love his work, big fan. But I think it's like fun to understand him in the political economy of his time. So that's the kind of stuff I do on Sweater Weather. Yeah, check me out there. It's like Facebook video, YouTube video, and available as an audio podcast everywhere as well. I'll talk about Canadian culture, politics, economics from a socialist perspective, and I interview a lot of authors and a lot of experts. And Rob, a couple of months ago, was kind enough to join me too. So
not an expert at anything, but I was happy to do it regardless.
Yeah, no, we had a good chat about the influence of American politics on Canadian politics, which is something we take for granted, but it's like worth like analyzing critically in some ways. So
I think so. Yeah, I still have many Americans that are like, what's this Canadian weighing in on like? And it's just like, are you serious? Are you serious? These Americans that pretend not to understand that they live in the dominant global superpower of the last 70 years and that everything that happens there has profound impact over Canada and indeed the entire world. And we should all be able to not only comment on America, but vote there as well. That's my stance on that.
Yeah, I agree. And I love your work. I tune into the Twitch stream when I can. And I'm like very very grateful for the opportunity to come talk to you about this stuff. I'd love to come back, talk about any new articles that come up too. So
anytime, man. Cool. I do these shows 4 hours at a time, so I'm always thankful to be able to have 30 minutes, 45 minutes to have a structured plan of something to do. So anytime you want to come on, feel free, just let me know.
Absolutely. Thanks.